Before I start, I'm going to come right out and say I know that this story doesn't make me look that great. I understand that what I was doing, what got me into this in the first place, it was wrong. There was no malice behind it. No voyeuristic sexuality involved. But I get it. Watching all those people, invading their privacy so deeply, it was a creepy thing to do. Does that mean I deserve what's happened? I don't think so. I hope not, at least. What I did was technically criminal, sure, but I can't shake the feeling that I've been sentenced to pay for it with my life. Unlike most on death row, though, I don't have the luxury of knowing the exact date of my punishment. All I have to go on is the vague sense of mortal dread that's been tugging at my gut more and more throughout the last few days. The sickening, nauseous plunge my heart takes into my groin every time I so much as glance at my bedroom window. Even with the curtains drawn and its lock latched, is how I know that I'm going to die, and almost definitely soon. Sure, there's more I could be doing to prevent it. Maybe I could alert the authorities, try and go to the hospital or maybe even a jail. Anyway, with surveillance of people and no goddamn windows. But I've never been very good at taking action. I'm really much more of a spectator. I suffer from what a therapist once described as crippling agoraphobia. It started out as a vague fear of crowds and public places that, following the car crash that claimed my mother's life and my own physical mobility, metastasized into a paralyzing, overwhelming aversion to human contact. My phobia has been swelled and sprawled since then, gradually reducing me from a nervous wreck to a social invalid to a full-blown hermit. I live in a small uptown apartment, a spare studio that I can luckily just barely manage to maintain on a spotty freelance writer salary and monthly disability checks. I don't exactly get out much. I can't stand the thought of running into a stranger, God help me, strangers. The mental image of pairs of eyes trained on me, taking to my patchy facial hair and greasy complexion and clumsy leg braces, stares hiding anything from pity to judgment to outright revulsion. It fills me with almost immediate panic. And so, to avoid that, I do the easy thing. I stay inside. I leave my apartment maybe 3 times a month, 4 if I'm feeling an emergency. I go out at 3ish in the morning, walk a few blocks down to a CVS and pick up basic necessities. Ramen, toilet paper, maybe some chips if I'm feeling frivolous. I use the self-checkout and I pile everything into a bag myself and I hurry home. It's been maybe 2 entire years since I last talked to somebody who wasn't delivering me takeout or expecting a rent check. Unfortunately even, I'm not completely asocial. Deep down, buried under a painful, self-perpetuating snowball of neurosis, I'm still a person, still completely subject to a basic need for human interaction. For a while, I filled the hole with podcasts and light TV, and then online chat rooms, and then an anonymous email-based pen pal service. But those all grew to feel insubstantial after a while. They left me feeling empty, like I'd try to satisfy hunger with chewing gum. One desperate evening, I stumbled across a method for viewing unsecured webcams, remotely and almost completely inconspicuously, and I knew almost immediately that I'd found my outlet. Well, okay, stumbled upon isn't the entire truth. I looked it up. Again, I know how creepy this appears on the surface, and I'm aware how morally iffy the practice is. But you need to understand that I was at the end of my rope in many ways, emotionally. I wouldn't say I was on the verge of outright suicide. That was too active, too messy. But I think I had it in me to just give up. I was very close to crawling into bed and never coming back out. It was a dark time in my life, and this webcam trick was a Hail Mary attempt to trick my diseased monkey brain into thinking I was socializing again, finally participating with other members of my species. And it worked. Though I'm sure I look pretty similar to the stereotype of a greasy antisocial computer hacker. I'm not actually amazing with computers, which speaks to how disturbingly easy the process of accessing these random webcams was. Most of the cameras were public use CCTV types, usually pointing at street corners or parking lots. Those were rarely very interesting, but even still, I was able to worm my way into quite a few personal webcams, usually asphyxiated to laptops or the occasional home desktop. I saw a lot of bedrooms, a lot of dorms, a few kitchens or living rooms, and more often than not the spaces I peeped at would be empty at first, and I often bookmark interesting ones to come back and check later for human activity. I ended up watching probably upwards of 100 people, keeping a rotating cast of a dozen or so that I found particularly entertaining. An old man with 3 pet birds in his room, who seemed to spend most of his time writing in his leather-bound notebook and hand-feeding his pets sunflower seeds. A diminutive Japanese woman with a genuinely impressive commitment to yoga. A university student who alternated between poring over complicated-looking architecture homework and smoking weed with a constantly shifting parade of boyfriends. And yeah, sure, cards on the table. I watched a few people have sex. Yes, that was wrong for me to do, but I feel the need to say that I didn't do that out of anything other than detached interest, and to God. My libido's about as dormant as Yellowstone at this point. I also watched plenty of eating. I saw an overwhelming amount of cereal eaten by people from all walks of life. Seriously, cereal is insanely popular. There was reading, aimless web surfing, talking, exercising, relaxing, cleaning and sleeping. Mostly sleeping. I got to the point where I struggled to doze off if I didn't have a feed of some stranger sleeping playing on my monitor. It was comforting in a very elemental way. It didn't eliminate my self-imposed loneliness, but it dulled the pain and made it manageable. Ironic that it was probably the most innocent aspect of my little one-man peep show that ended up dooming me. It was late one night, late even for me, and at this point I was almost entirely nocturnal. I was sifting through my list of bookmarked webcams, looking for something to put on while I turned in. Most of my usual favorites were off the table that night. Either their laptops were put away or they were pointed in the wrong direction, or the subject themselves was either obstructed by something or gone from the room entirely. So I dove back into the raw feed of new potential cams, clicking past parking lot after parking lot, after abandoned computer lab after parking lot, until I came across one that had caught my attention. On my screen I saw a youngish girl, maybe in her mid-20s, kneeling on her sheets, peering out of the window set into the wall right above her bed. Something about the way she was sitting, the nervous, insecure folding of her arms, the hunched over shoulders, the wary, almost defensive way she was peeking out of the window, had caught me off guard. I'm not the most socially intuitive person in the world, but even I could read the obvious body language on display here. This girl was scared. Her room was decently well lit, considering the lateness of the hour. Between the lava lamp on her bedside table and the several yards of fairy lights strung up on the ceiling, I could make out most of the room. It was tidy in a crowded way, packed with neatly arranged stacks of books and baskets of laundry. The fidelity of the camera was high, so her computer must have been relatively new. And between that and the fancy four-poster that she was kneeling on, I got the sense that this woman was very successful. An observation that made her shivering. Fretful vigil at the window seemed even more unusual. What was she looking at? The woman made a few more attempts at looking outside, taking quick, bird-like glances through the window before ducking back behind her wall. She had kept this up for maybe another half an hour before, eventually, settling back into bed, clutching her covers in tight fists, eyes clenched shut. I kept watching. Something about the surrealness of the situation had jolted the exhaustion out of me. My pulse had picked up inexplicably, and I found that I was sweating a bit. I pulled up a cheery sitcom on another monitor and I waited, glancing back towards the girl every few minutes. Around dawn, I saw her jolt awake, head whipping around to face the window. I couldn't hear anything. I only had access to the webcam's visuals, not the audio. But by the way she sat, head tilted to the side, hands held out, still intense, was a picture of someone straining to hear something. Whatever noise had woken her up must have sounded again because she jumped, scooting away from the wall and climbing out of her bed, eyes fixed on the window. Without looking down, she fumbled with her bedside table, grabbing for her phone. She brought it to her face, dialed a number, and backed out of the webcam's field of vision. I had watched that feed well past daybreak, until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. She had never re-entered the frame, never opened the blinds, and I went to bed completely bemused by what I had seen. I rested fitfully. I think that I had a nightmare, but when I woke up that evening, I couldn't recall the details. I continued to tune into the girl's webcam several times a night, hoping that I'd see something that might explain what had terrified her so much. Nearly a week later, I caught her staring out of her window again, phone held in one hand, ready to be dialed. But usually I just see her sleeping soundly, or occasionally watching TV. Whatever had startled her before failed to show up, at least at first. One night I tuned in to see her room shrouded in an uncharacteristic darkness. Normally the woman slept with her fairy lights on, but for the first time that I'd seen, she had a man over, and he must have insisted they sleep in the dark. I imagine they came to a compromise because the lava lamp was still on, casting shifting, meager orange lights around the room. The window blinds had been left open, and from what I could tell, it was too dark outside to make out any details past the glass, but for whatever reasons, I couldn't take my eyes off of it. Something about the window seemed off, and I don't think it was the fact that it was the first time that I'd seen it opened. The darkness outside of it was bugging me. A cold, rolling anxiety sprouted in my gut, making me shiver as I squinted at the dark pixels. I thought for a second, and I caught something glinting in the shadows just outside the glass. But if I did, it was impossibly brief and incredibly slight. Nothing that the woman's PC webcam, as nice as it was outfitted to capture clearly. Out of curiosity, I took a few screenshots and pulled them up in a photo editor. I played with the contrast and saturation of it, pausing every few minutes to check back in on the webcam feed. Most of the screenshots bleed nothing out of the ordinary, even with extensive tinkering, but cranking up the brightness on one revealed a twin pair of white dots, barely a few pixels in diameter, floating in the center of the dark window. These dots could have been anything, from video artifacts to insects, hell, and chances are they were probably a product of my own tinkering with the image, but I couldn't get them out of my mind. When I went to sleep that night, I dreamed of the eyes and the shadows. When I checked the webcam the next night, the room was even darker than last time. The lava lamp had been turned off. Squinting at the image, I could just make out the dark outline of the window, backlit by a thin moonlight. The blinds were gone. Not just unshuttered, but completely missing, leaving the window bare, exposing the glass. No, wait. The window was open. I could see it now. I could just barely make out the white lip of the bottom pane, pulled up to its highest point, exposing the room to the night with no apparent screen or barrier. I couldn't make out anything else in the room. I couldn't even see if the woman was home. The moonlight was too dim, and the webcam was too limited. I started to get that anxious feeling again, looking into the dark of her room. Before I could reconsider, I exited the surveillance program, wheeling backwards from the chair. Somehow I knew that scanning the darkness again would do nothing but further disturb me, and I fell moments away from a panic attack as it was. Looking back, I didn't have any concrete reason for this panic, nothing specific that I could point to. People open their windows plenty often, and it doesn't mean anything. But somehow, instinctively, I knew to be worried. I checked back in on her at dawn, now that the sun was out and I could clearly make out everything in her room. The window was indeed open, the blinds completely missing from the frame. The floor and shelves were as neat and busy as always, almost entirely undisturbed. The bed, though, it was a mess. The blankets and sheets were piled in a tangled lump in the middle of the mattress, and the half-dozen throw pillows that usually line the bed frame were lying in scattered disarray. I couldn't tell if the pile on the bed concealed a sleeping person or not. The comforter was too bulky. The shape was too ambiguous. There was a brownish splotch on one of the pillows that I could have sworn wasn't there before. One that looked not unlike a stain. When I checked back in that evening, nothing had changed. The bed remained messy. The lump was still there. When I looked at dusk and I saw the same thing, I felt my mouth go dry and my stomach drop. I knew more and more confident that there was somebody in that bed, and that they haven't moved an inch in nearly 24 hours. I should have called the police, I know that. But then, what would I have said? I knew nothing about where this woman lived. I still don't. Other than the fact that she must have occupied roughly the same time zone as me. Maybe the police could have used her IP address to narrow things down. But then I'd have to provide that, wouldn't I? And I'm not sure what I was doing was illegal, if not exactly something you get life in Alcatraz for. And then of course, a police call would have involved interaction. Face-to-face contact with probably a half-dozen strangers, over the course of maybe a few days. Stressful conversations. Tense ones. So I chickened out. I did the cowardly thing and I just kept watching. I tuned in at around 2 in the morning that night, and this time, I swallowed the fear seeping up my throat like bile and scrutinized the hell out of the darkness on my screen. It was a full moon that night, and her window must have been facing west because the room was surprisingly well lit, in comparison to how it had been the night previous. Silver white light silhouetted the major features of the room, a space I had come to be intimately familiar with over the last few weeks. The bed was different, and that was the first thing that I had noticed. The mass in the covers was still there, but something had rested atop it. An egg-shaped blot of gray-black shadow. It was shifting almost imperceptibly, rocking back and forth, so I knew that it was animate. At first I assumed it was a woman. If she had been sitting fetal atop her bed, then it might have been roughly the right size, but something about the way it moved made that hard to believe. It was writhing, shuddering a few inches back and forth with manic quickness. And there was a release of some sort, a sudden relief of tension, and the shape rocked back. A limb-like protrusion drawing back from the bed. Something clutched in it. It had been pulling on something, had torn something off, and now the limb was bringing it back to the center of the mass. It was then that I noticed the twin white dots, again almost too small to be recognizable, set in the center of the shape. The instant I found them, the form ceased all movement, becoming instantly still. My heart burned in my chest as the dots slowly rose and fixed themselves in the direction of the webcam. The shape extended another limb towards the bed and began violently tugging, ripping at whatever the sheets were concealing. The dots still fixed on the camera. On me. It was too much. I turned off my monitor with a shaking hand, and then I unplugged my PC. I bit back the urge to vomit and instead worked on keeping my breathing regular, my heart rate down. I again found myself struggling with the idea of calling the authorities. I could take a fine. I could take some minimum security prison time, if they let me remain isolated. It was obvious that whatever I'd stumbled into was bigger than anything I was equipped to deal with. There was danger here, vague and hard to define. There was something primal about the fear that I felt. The terror of a prey animal squinting its eyes and straining its ears, trying to determine if there is a predator in the bush. I made the mistake of waiting. I made the mistake of turning my computer back on. I made the mistake of pulling out my surveillance program and making my way to the woman's feed. It was morning now, and I wanted to check, one last time, to help me decide if I should get a third party involved. I blinked at the screen. I leaned towards my monitor, gawking in disbelief, and then recoiled when I came to recognize what I was seeing. I screamed. Sitting in the woman's open window, perched haphazardly on the sill, was the woman's head. Her face, a slack, unmoving grimace, was still perfectly recognizable, but her throat was little more than brutalized meat. The head hadn't been cut off. It had been torn from its body, ripped unceremoniously from its base, and enshrined in the window like some perverted trophy. It was turned to face the webcam, the woman's half-littled eyes set to stare unblinking into my own. Everything about it looked deliberate. It looked like a message. I see you. I still haven't called anyone. It's classic me, really. I'm too paralyzed by my fears and neurosis, by my own crippling inabilities, to do anything but watch and to wait. Something tapped at my window in my bedroom tonight. I can't open it. I refuse to. I can't run either. I can't hide. So I'm going to watch and I'm going to wait. There it is again. I can hear it from here.